the making of the European global order. As mentioned in chapter 23, that was a big overview of the chapter, we're going to see imperialism come into play. The first thing that we're going to look at in chapter 24 is kind of a recap, just kind of like your shows like Lost in 24. They always have like that 2-minute recap of what happened beforehand. Same thing this chapter does for you. That first section is recapping what happened in the early modern period, not just the chapter before, but the early modern period, and how exploration and the beginning of industrialization is leading into imperialism. So that way you see that connection of what happened with exploration and what happened with industrialization that spurs on imperialism. And we'll see more as we look at this chapter with some of the readings we're going to do and some of the political cartoons we're going to look at in understanding imperialism a little bit more. The prototype, the Dutch advance on Java, there's going to be some similarities between the British and India and the Dutch and Java. There'll also be some major differences we'll look at as well. But mainly to understand, in the beginning, the British and the Dutch were willing to pay tribute to these areas. Their factories that they were setting up in Africa and India and Java, they were willing to pay the tribute that they needed for them. Well, as time starts to advance, as they are the more stronger military power, what we're going to see is there's going to be rivalries between local princes in these areas, and the Dutch and Java and the British and India are going to take advantage of that. The major difference between the British and the Dutch is the British are going to also be competing against other European nations, specifically France, where the Dutch are pretty much, they have their region of Malaysia, Indonesia that they are controlling. The pivot of world empire, the rise of the British rule in India. As I just mentioned, you had the princes in the Java region that were rivaling against each other. Same thing that's going to happen with the British. There was some princes that were siding with the French, some princes that were siding with the British, and the British are going to use this to their advantage with their military power. As we've already talked about the end of the Mughal Empire, you had fragmentation, these princes coming back into more power as they had originally had beforehand. We'll see the sepoys, which are Indian troops trained in European style fighting. We will even see them all the way up into World War I, where they're heavily involved in South Africa, North Africa, Australia, troops being sent out, even during this time period, fighting in Afghanistan and Nepal, where they'll be controlling areas for the British Empire. 1757, the Battle at Plassey. Robert Clive is going to defeat the Bengal rulers, which were having French influence, and that will kind of be the starting point for the British, and as other princes fight each other, they'll continue to take more land. So the princes were more self-consumed with their rivalries than they were what was happening with the British gaining more and more land. Here's the Battle of Plassey here in the Bengal area. Here's a famous painting of Clive when he meets the Indian leaders. The consolidation of the British rule, the Mughal decline, obviously gives them the opportunity. This is going to set the precedent where they will ask for land in return for aiding some of these princes. And this will start with some of their bigger areas in the Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, where they will start spreading, slowly gaining more land as they make these treaties with these other princes. And the rest of India indirectly controlled. So the process, make sure you understand the map, 1767 to 1805 to 1858, controlling most of the area with the British Empire. Earlier colonial society in India and Java, originally there was a lot of interaction. The social order, except for the fact that the Europeans would put themselves on top, predominantly stayed the same. And you'll see males marrying the indigenous women. You'll have a mixed race that's going to occur. A lot of men going to brothels, prostitution. Even the women down in the marketplace a lot in some of these areas, as mentioned, like Bombay and Calcutta and Calicut in the Madras area. Same thing with Java and the Dutch in their area. So there was a little bit more interaction in the beginning. Social orders kind of left alone, culture left alone, so to speak. They were just looking for getting those natural resources for industrialization. Social reform in the colonies, the British forced to take direct control. In the 1770s, you're going to have a famine in Bengal where your Indian administrative officials had become corrupt. They were seeing the fact that they were being controlled by the British Empire. They decided to take the opportunity, become powerful themselves, take advantage of the situation. and they become corrupt. And so they're taking in the money, not making sure that agriculture is self-sufficient with its irrigation. They're not aiding the people with storage of the food, and so a famine occurs. And obviously when a famine occurs, the people are rebelling, and so therefore the British government's having to come in. They tell the British East India Company that we're going to take more control from you since things don't seem to be working, and so Indians are excluded from administration. And reforms are going to be something that come about. The watershed attempt to reshape the colonial society. They'll allow evangelical Christians to come in. Not much of a conversion attempt, but more of a social reform attempt. And hopefully if you have conversions through that, then obviously that's fine through the evangelical Protestants, that being their ultimate goal. But more or less, more social reform than anything, trying to end the slave trade, trying to end slavery as a whole too, as the slave trade had started coming to an end by the 1880s. I think Brazil in the 1880s was the last one. And so trying to end slavery as a whole, end the Sati movement in India with the burning of the widows. So there was a lot of social reform that was occurring as well. Colonial wars in the apex of European imperialism. You're going to have the mass production of weapons. That's going to let imperialism spread as Europeans become more powerful. They become more bold. Originally, one of the reasons they weren't so big on imperialism beforehand as far as building empires in these areas was it would cause a lot of man force and a lot of power, and spreading your forces too thin. As they become stronger with their military and more dominant, especially with the machine gun, railroads, steamships, the telephone line, communication becoming much more instant, there's a lot more attempts to control these areas on more of an empire scale with imperialism. The Pacific, one thing to note is you're going to see 3 new countries getting involved here. Germany and Europe, your typical Europeans, the British, the Dutch, the French, for the most part, were in this area to begin with. Early on you saw the Spanish and the Portuguese, but they're starting to be more or less taken by the Dutch and the British, and even somewhat the French. But one thing to note is you're going to see the Germans coming into the Pacific and into Africa. You'll see the United States coming into the Pacific, and in a few chapters we're going to look at Japan. But for this, just note that the Germans expanding, and we're going to again see them leading into World War I, and of course the US, their imperialism in the Pacific and Latin America. The Partition of Africa, your maps and your power notes, you'll see the beginning stage, and then the ending stage of basically Africa being carved up for their natural resources. Here's the entries into these areas by their countries as well. Here's some of the rebellions, the areas being annexed, your uprisings with their dates. Here's the beginning of imperialism. Obviously the little red areas are where, where people were rebelling and fighting anti-colonial revolts. Here's the end. You'll still see people revolting, but obviously you can see the domination that Europe has over this region. Okay, in the areas we had 3 kinds of dominance, and this is where you're going to see your change in continuity start to occur. Tropical dependencies, this was Africa, Asia, South Pacific, Europeans rule indigenous people. This is where you have a minority of Europeans ruling a majority of indigenous people. Settler colonies, you'll have 2 types. The white dominions, this is Canada, Australia, and this is where your Europeans are the majority ruling over a minority of indigenous people. And then your second type, which was the contested areas, as it says contested, a large number of Europeans, a large number of indigenous people. This will be where a lot of your heavy revolts and anti-colonialism will exist because of the tensions that are going to occur. The colonial regimes and social hierarchies and the tropical dependencies, you'll have huge cultural influences where a lot of these missionaries are teaching English as education. And this is, at the beginning, this is the idea of the white supremacy, where they think they are better and they need to fix these cultures and they need to educate these cultures. And ironically enough, it's this education that's going to make them revolt in the end and want their freedom from these nations. Here's your divisions of Australia and New Zealand. Changing social relations between coloners and the colonized. As this movement of social reform comes in and the evangelical Protestants come in, you're going to see some changes. It's no longer, not that it was like hugely acceptable, but you're not going to see the trend of men in brothels and prostitution. You're not going to see intermarriage anymore. Women won't be going down to the marketplaces as frequently. It'll be more of a formal occasion when they do so. European communities are going to grow, so segregation, something that's going to increase in these areas. And you'll even see that tension all the way up to this modern period in South Africa. Ideas of white supremacy, again, that they were the better people, that not only should they be going in economically, but they should be going in for humanitarian reasons, and they should be helping these people who aren't as well off, aren't as smart, to them anyway. And so they think they are God's given right to aid these people no matter what the situation and no matter what the cost is. And so this is why there's a lot of tension in some of these areas with the Europeans and even the United States, in the Pacific and in Latin America. The shifts in methods of economic extraction drive to increase production, lower costs. Many colonies become dependent. So the Europeans are going to build railways, the telephone lines for communication. They'll build their harbors for shipping. They'll build road systems, all of this to extract the natural resources. So the natural resources leave these nations, and so does the money as well. And so when there is, in the next unit, we'll see a lot of these areas gain independence. There is some struggles because the Europeans depleted the natural resources and took a lot of the money. And so even though some infrastructure was built, when the Europeans leave, there's nobody left to continue with those foundations of your infrastructure, and so things start to deteriorate. Countries are left as dependents upon these other nations, and so there's the struggle, and there lies, a lot of people argue, well, they would have been in this situation to begin with, but then the flip side is, well, the Europeans got them in the situation to begin with and they were fine beforehand. And places like India, where their industry was picking up, the Europeans go in there and crush it and take it from them, and so there's the argument, well, they were becoming industrialized and were succeeding on their own, and then the Europeans went in there and took it. So there's a lot of tension between some of this during this time period. One thing that's going to aid in this, disease will not become a major factor as there's a better understanding of the diseases and where they are located geographically, like the Dutch moving more inland and higher elevations to get away from insects that had malaria and things like that. Also better medications and vaccines coming about. Some native people will become westernized, but there will be some resistance as well. One of those resistant areas, you're going to have the Boers, where you had your mixed races and still wanting to keep their society with their farming and herding. You'll have some conflicts between the Boers and the Bantu people and who is actually controlling South Africa. And we'll look at that a little bit more in depth with the second Boer War that occurs. Here's an image of the Great Trek, a famous painting during that time period. The Pacific tragedies, New Zealand taken, and as a lot of places were taken in the Pacific, in some of these smaller areas, widespread alcoholism and prostitution spreads as people have become depressed because their homeland's being taken, their culture being taken, their way of life being taken, and so they turn to other means. The Moorish will adopt firearms. There is major change by the 1850s, and the British bring in farming. And I think even to this day, there's twice as many sheep as there are people in New Zealand. And the Moorish will adopt more European cultures as time moves on. In Hawaii, James Cook, just as we've seen a lot of other Europeans as they've landed in some of these areas like Latin America, they're looked at as a god. Originally, the prince will go for westernization. A little bit too late when they realize what's occurring and they try to rebel and not want it as much. But by then you have too many weak rulers. And by 1810, they will rule the Hawaiian kingdom. Disease is going to devastate the population, and so there is a shift in that area, and eventually it will be annexed by the United States, and they will be pushing to rule it by the end of the 1800s. Here's your colonialism areas. from 1815 to 1914, who's controlling them. Here's your areas in Southwest, South, and East Asia. And again, we'll look a little bit more at some of these areas by the end of this chapter. Here's some of your major rebellions during this time period, which are mentioned in some of these other chapters that we'll be looking at as well. Here's your major connection between the great powers and their colonial possessions in 1913.